Civic Series. Chance where you can unmute your microphone. But right now, tell us where you're from, and if it's your first time here at Civic Series, let us know that too. So type in the chat your name, where you're from, just so we can get a read of where everyone's tuning in from. And if you're watching on YouTube, also feel free to put your name and where you're from in the chat box, and we'll give you a shout out. I'll go first. My name's Anna. I am in Louisville, Kentucky, and I will be moderating today's event.
And I'm Lar, and I'm calling in from Philadelphia, and I'll be your host.
Should I?
Sure.
I'm Pierce calling in from Lincoln, Nebraska, and I'll be talking about political psychology.
Great. All right, we have Lauren is from Boston. Hello, Lauren. We have Lucia from Colombia. Hello. Our producer, Dave Lashansky from Del Mar, California. Christina from Toronto, Canada. Hey, Christina. And we love seeing your faces, so definitely turn on your video so we can see your lovely faces and be able to, oh, there you are. Thanks, Lauren, I see you there. Jacob is listening from Bryan, Texas. We have Michael and Claudia from Philadelphia. Hi there.
Great. We're just going to wait a few more minutes as people tune in.
Mm-hmm.
If you just joined, feel free to put your name and location in the chat box, and Anna will read it out loud so we can welcome the folks who just attended, who just joined. Great. Should we get started?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, great. So hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Lar Hesse-Fischer. I'm the founder and director of Civic Series. And if you're unfamiliar with Civic Series, if this is your first event, we are a volunteer-led nonprofit organization that helps people understand and think for themselves and have meaningful conversations about the most important issues of our time. Our events like this one help you get oriented to what's going on in the world and allow you to ask questions of experts in a nonpartisan and safe space. So today we'll be asking our guest expert, Professor Piers Ekstrom, who decides our political opinion? Like, how do we form our political beliefs, and to what extent are we influenced in them? You know, what role do the politicians play? Does the media play? How do friends and family influence us? And are today's politics really more polarized than in the past? And are we doomed because of that? So before we begin, I'd like to give a big thank you to our sponsors. I'm just going to share my screen. We have the Rhyme and Reason Fund of the Boston Foundation, Dan and Amy Harris. We recently received a grant from the Lincoln and Teresa Filing Foundation. And then also we have people like you who have submitted when they registered, they donated through PayPal, Venmo, and Eventbrite. Civic Series is a 501c3 charity. And if you can spare your contributions go very far in letting us produce content like this. And you can find us on Venmo or PayPal. You can visit civicseries.org/donate, and we'll include those links in the chat as well. If you've already donated or choose to donate now, so thank you so much for your contribution. Okay, here is how this evening is going to go. For the first 20 or 30 minutes, I'll have a fireside chat with our guest expert, Professor Piers Ekstrom. to give an overview of tonight's topic, and then we'll open it up for your questions for about 40 minutes. At the top of the hour, we'll jump into breakout groups, and then we'll come all back together to answer more questions before we wrap up at 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. So our events, when we pre-COVID, when we had our events in person, they're pretty interactive, and we're going to replicate that here. So I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Anna, who's going to explain how this is going to work for those of you who are new to Civic Series.
Great. Yep, so my name's Anna. I'll be moderating the event today. So one thing we love to have everyone do is turn your video on, even though we have you muted. It helps us kind of recreate that atmosphere that we had before COVID. If you have questions during the event, put them in the chat box. We will have the chat box live for everyone to see those questions. And once the Q&A time comes, I'll introduce you, and then you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask your questions live to be able to interact with Professor Pierce here during the event. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can call or text your questions into our voicemail box and our Google Voice number, and I'll put that in the chat here on Zoom and on the YouTube page. So we'll also be asking questions that you submitted when you registered. When you registered on Eventbrite, you may have put some things that you were interested in. So we'll be going through some of those as the Q&A time comes. And then after the Q&A, we have a time for breakout rooms. This will be about 7 to 8 minutes, and it'll be a time for just you to talk with other people who are here in the event to digest what was talked about and discussed, and just to process what's still on your mind. And if during the breakout session, if it comes to a natural close, feel free to step out of your breakout room and go back to the lobby. And we'll have some breakout questions that will just help get the conversation going, but no pressure if those questions are not what you want to talk about. And then after that, we'll come back for more Q&A. All right, and back to you, Laura.
Great, thanks, Anna. So I want to emphasize that in Civic Series, we have a saying, which is there's no such thing as a dumb question. The point of Civic Series is to ask the questions that you fear are too dumb to ask anywhere else, and I will volunteer to be the dumbest person in the Zoom room. Okay, so I am very pleased to introduce our guest expert today. Professor Pierce Ekstrom is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He studies political preferences and the desirable and undesirable effects of political disagreement. Professor Ekstrom, we're so pleased to have you here today.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I really do appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk to people about this stuff. It's what I do.
That's great. Well, we're really happy to have you. Thank you for being generous with your time with us. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we jump in?
Not really. I'm happy to get going.
All right, great. So let's do it. So first of all, you study political psychology. You're a political psychologist. What is that? What is political psychology?
So you might get a different definition depending on who you ask, but I think of political psychology as the study of how people think, feel, and behave in political contexts, which is a big umbrella, and I think intentionally, right? Any way you can imagine human psychology sort of impinging on the political sphere or vice versa, that I think is kind of what we're talking about. Okay, so when you and I were discussing this event, I asked you, what are the things that influence what I believe politically? About anything, about healthcare policy or the Second Amendment or equity issues, but you said that we needed to ask a more fundamental question first, like what you said was, what are the things that make up what I believe? Like, what is my political belief comprised of? So what is that? What are the things that we need to understand first before we understand what influences us? Sure, and I think it helps set the stage, right? I mean, probably the first thing that comes to mind when I think of a political belief is somebody's position on a specific political issue, right? Taxes, healthcare, abortion, same-sex marriage, right? These are political beliefs, but they're very specific ones. And in the business, we would call these issue positions or issue attitudes, right? But there are also much broader opinions, right? Or attachments or what have you. Probably the second and maybe the most important type of opinion I'd want to stress is political identities, in particular partisan identities, right? The extent to which you call yourself in the US today usually a Republican or a Democrat, though of course there are other parties people can identify with. That's a very powerful political opinion, political attachment in a way. So you've got issue positions, you've got political identities, and third and finally, you have ideologies, which are bigger picture ideas about the way the world is and the way the world should be, that might consist of kind of an interconnected network of dozens of issue attitudes or your party identification or what have you. So those are kind of, I think, in my head at least, the big three sort of types of political preferences that people have.
And can you give me an example of an ideology?
Oh, sure. Liberal or conservative probably would be the labels we'd use in contemporary US most of the time.
Okay, so the second one, so the first one is about specific things. Like for me, climate change is a big thing for me. So climate change is how I feel about a particular issue. And then the second is what party I identify with, which is really important in the United States and probably other contexts too, but certainly in the US.
Yeah.
And then the broader thing is, you know, do I consider myself liberal or conservative? Like these broader identities.
Exactly.
Okay.
And you know, there's some room for overlap there, but I can complicate the picture later on if you want.
Okay, well, let's see. We'll see if in the Q&A if people want us
If
to get
anybody- yeah, for sure.
more complicated, which we probably will. So, the Republican versus Democrat is a big conversation in the United States, right? We're a two-party system. So, what are the fundamental values that underlie these two parties?
So I think I've braced you for my hot take here, and it might sound a little bit cynical, but I'm not sure that we can necessarily say that values do underlie people's attachments to Republican or party identification. We can certainly say that Republicans and Democrats value different things, but whether people are Republican or Democrat because of the values they had sort of before they ever adapted that party identification is not something that has as much support and evidence as you might expect.
So it's a chicken and the egg issue, you're saying.
Right.
There's what comes first, your values or the party that you feel like you belong to. So what you're saying is that in your field, most people think that you actually decide your party and then your values follow your party as opposed to the other way around?
That's what most of the evidence that I'm aware of suggests. Now, that doesn't mean that
And you would know, right?
I would hope. Yes. But it's interesting, right? Because I think even within my field, right, we tend to, I put it that way because a lot of us have had and do have sort of this long-standing working assumption that certain things come before your party identification, and one of them is your values. And I think there are not a small number of people engaged in political psychological work now who would continue to say, you know, I really think that values come before party identification. Even I mean, I would think that there must be some values out there that come before it. But we do have some evidence for people who have, from people who have looked at this over time, right? So you ask people to report their moral values, right? You ask people to report their party identification, their ideology, and you see how these things change over time. And those studies, for now, looking at the values that we have sort of categorized, find that it is the political commitment, right, Republican or Democrat, that comes before the value rather than the other way around. And maybe it'd be useful for me to make this a little bit more concrete, right? So the particular values I'm talking about, the ways that Republicans and Democrats tend to differ from each other, are in that Democrats care a lot about fairness, justice, equality, and above all, sort of the harm done or the help offered to people in need. Republicans also value those things, but they also afford some moral significance, much more than Democrats do, to following authority, to certain types of loyalty, especially to one's country, and the giving sort of serious consideration to the divine, and religion, and sort of the things beyond material, literal sort of utilitarian ideas, right?
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense, right? It's like we grow up in our environments, we're influenced by our parents or whoever is raising us, we're influenced by the people around us. And so then our views of the world and what's right and what's wrong is shaped by those people around us.
Right. And that's the idea, right? That it's not to say that these values are dishonest, sort of inventions of the parties necessarily, right? But rather there are all kinds of things that can push you to adopt a party identification before you've really given these big values much consideration in the abstract, right? And that gives a window for party identification to influence the values that you have.
I'm just laughing because we have the green screen thing that you warned us might
Oh,
happen, and it
I'm
just
sorry.
happened. No, it's okay. So that's interesting. Then the question that I have next is, then I mean, is there such thing as Republicans other than people who belong to the Republican Party? Is there such thing as Democrats than people who belong to the Democratic Party? Like, is there anything else that kind of unites them?
I mean, that's how we would define it, right? So other things, certainly there are things that they have in common on average, right?
And
But
those are the qualities that you mentioned before, right? Like equity and harm, concern about harm, and then on the other side, it's authority and the divine. You know, that
right,
those two spectrums there.
right. But there are also any number of, those are the values, right? But think of all the other things that partisanship might cause you to do differently, right? Whether it's like wearing masks, or your positions on certain political issues, or where you live, what kind of, some of these things may or may not actually come directly from partisanship, right? But they're not they're not necessarily less connected to partisanship than values are. These are traits and characteristics that Democrats and Republicans tend to have.
All right. So one of the things that you and I were talking about as we were discussing this topic was about consistency and ideological consistency. And I could imagine that if you're not picking your party from a blank slate, like here are my values, and now I'm looking at the world from a blank slate, and then I'm picking which party, then it makes sense that you'd be inconsistent because we're just growing up and influenced by the world, but not necessarily being super. Well, let me ask you. I guess is there research that indicates, are people super thoughtful about what they're or reflective on what their ideologies are and what shapes them, or is it just kind of a blind bucket and water to the fish?
Well, it varies a lot from person to person and time to time, right? Like, I don't want to, certainly there are a large number of Americans who don't devote a lot of time to thinking through their political ideologies. There were some early studies in the 60s in particular that went looking very hard for sort of what American ideologies were, right? Were people thinking in terms of left and right the way the political system was structured? Did they have sort of their own private ideologies that didn't map onto these things? Or somewhere in between, or were they not really thinking in these terms? And the studies at that time tended to find that people had very stable partisan attachments to Republican or Democrat, but that their positions on specific political issues fluctuated wildly from year to year. Like, if you ask somebody their attitude on military spending one year, and then you asked it again the year after that and the year after that, it was very difficult to predict where they'd land on it a year later.
But their party affiliation would stay consistent,
Yes.
but their actual opinion on specific issues would change.
Yes.
Yeah, go
ahead.
I was going to say, is it bad that people are inconsistent? I mean, is that something that we should be worried about and trying to correct, trying to make our ideologies more consistent?
At the time, I think political scientists were worried about it because one, it suggests that people aren't, the democratic process depends on people having meaningful preferences, right? We elect officials, we occasionally vote for policies through referenda or what have you, right? And if in the end, we don't really care, or the preferences we have are so noisy that they can't be relied upon to stay consistent from year to year, then it kind of raised this question. Well, hang on, do we want these people, where these people were almost everyone, running the country, or trying to through votes and stuff like that? Now, people who were more attentive to politics had more stable preferences. That's continued to be the case. But that was a concern. That said, there are also reasons to be a little bit less pessimistic about it. One reason might be that the appearance of inconsistency is only sort of superficial, right? That people look inconsistent when you ask them survey questions for other reasons, like maybe there are real differences in the world between when you ask the question 1 year ago versus now.
Right, right.
So, for example, right, if you were doing a big political survey of national opinion in the US, and you want to know how people feel about laws regulating protests, right? Free speech, that's controversial. And we do have some of these laws, right? They do exist, so it's not beyond the pale. And if I ask you in the survey how strict you think these kinds of policies can be or ought to be, right? Imagine I give you that question in June of last year, of 2020, right? How closely should we regulate protests? Now, my survey respondents are going to be thinking probably about the protests that followed George Floyd's death, right? And that's going to color their responses to that question. And so you'll have people think like, oh, I think that the protests need to be more or less regulated, depending. Now, if you ask that same question of maybe even the same people in early January of 2021, after what happened on January 6th in the Capitol this year, you might get a different response, right? People, depending on their different political outlooks and how they thought, how they reacted to that protest, might change the considerations that are sort of rising to the top of their head when they answer that question. And that might make people look inconsistent, but it's not because necessarily they're not paying attention. In fact, people might be more inconsistent to the extent that they're paying a lot of attention.
And I can see also it's what we want, right? We want people to be influenced and to consider things differently. And if they have lived experiences, that influences how they see things.
For sure. It is good. You want people to respond to external reality. But there is also this sort of second issue that the question you're asking about, right, is ostensibly about laws regulating protest. But that word protest is evoking potentially different phenomena for different people at different times. Now you can refine the question to be more specific, right? A protest about, an election versus a police shooting, but that's, it's a different question, and usually we want to know broader opinions and preferences than that.
So I want to go back to my original question, which is, now we understand the kinds of things that make up our political beliefs. Now we also understand that political beliefs and political party are very closely tied to each other, but maybe not in the way that we might have thought, or at least that I had thought originally, that maybe party comes first before beliefs. So, okay, so then what are the different factors that shape our political beliefs? Where do my thoughts about specific issues or my political identity, my ideology come from?
Sure. Is my video still green?
It is, yeah.
I'm going to just real quick see if this does anything.
Still green.
That's fine. Okay. So I'll just get on with it. I'm
yeah, we'll just get on. It's all good.
So what shapes my political beliefs? That's your question, right?
Yeah.
I would say, and the answer to this is, it's a big question, right? And we're all constantly looking for this, right? But a few things that are well documented are your parents' political beliefs influence you, right? The environment you grow up in, they have a lot of control over that. People often, I think, learn about politics initially from their parents. That's a big part of it. Our peers, right? Other people in our lives, especially after, we leave our parents' house, they have a big influence. Not a big surprise there, probably. The other things that can matter that people are sometimes more surprised by and include sort of genetic factors. So there have been studies showing that ideology and partisanship have heritable components. Now that's not to say, that a baby wakes up on its first day and decides, I'm a Republican, or that you can tell that that's definitely where they're going to be, right? These are complex behaviors that emerge from an interaction between the person and their environment over time, but they do seem to have a heritable component. People's personality traits, which might in fact have something to do with how politics are inherited, but that's still the
What do we know
subject.
about what do scientists know, or what do they think about, or they've seen regarding personality traits?
So there are a couple traits. One, openness to new experiences, and two, conscientiousness, that have been found to predict political preferences pretty reliably. Openness to new experiences is, the extent to which you want to do things that are new, different, novel, right? It's related to sensation seeking, interest in art and abstract ideas. It's associated with higher political liberalism and less with political conservatism. Conscientiousness, now this relationship is a little bit weaker, but it is there, is people's tendency to prefer order and organization, to feel their responsibilities and see it as important to sort of uphold those responsibilities. Conscientiousness tends to be positively associated with conservatism rather than liberalism.
That's interesting.
So those are the two big traits that come to mind for me. Causes of political preferences, you've got your parents, your peers, your genes, and your personality. Now, personality is also partly heritable. And I will say that, so when we're talking about sort of parents, peers, and genetics and personality, I've been talking about the predictors of ideology and partisanship. Issue positions, your positions on specific political issues often flow from your partisanship rather than the other way around. Now, that's not always the case, and I hate to tell all these pessimistic stories, but it's kind of part of the business. But issue positions tend to come from a combination of partisanship and our attention to the news media and public officials' rhetoric and that sort of thing. But it is sometimes the case that people choose their parties based on their issue positions.
Okay, so you mentioned that you're getting a somewhat cynical take on this. So is it true then that we're all just products of our society when it comes to these things, that we don't have our own beliefs, that we are just influenced by whatever mass media, whatever bubble that we're in? What kind of agency do we have?
So it's a great question, and one that we talk about in grad school. We do have some agency, right? I mean, first, when I say that people's political attitudes are influenced by their parents and their peers, parents and peers are people too, right? We're all somebody's peer. Some of us are people's parents, right? Or a person's parent or people's parent. In any case, parents are out there and they're people and they have political opinions, right? And so parents have agency, peers have agency. We influence other people just as other people influence us, right? There's no harm in that. But also when I say personality matters, right? I'm not trying to say we are hardwired, right? Like we are babies that emerge into this world ready to believe in conservatism or liberalism, right? We are not, that's not the point I want to get across, right? Because what personality tells us is what are the things you tend to do? What are the things you tend to like? What are the things you tend to dislike, right? That's your personality. Your personality is who you are. It's a mechanism of your agency, right? So if you are, we're in the 2008 election, because in my mind, it's still basically 2008. And you have messaging going out from Obama that says, change we can believe in, right? And you are somebody who's high in openness to experiences, right? To new experiences. You've got this kind of novelty seeking, like, yeah, I want to try something new and different. And one of the candidates is saying, change we can believe in. That will be more appealing to you if you're high in that personality trait than it would be if you were very low in that personality trait. If you prefer to stay closer to home, if you prefer the things that are familiar to you, the ideas that you've grown up with, right? It's a difference between people.
Can I ask a question about that part, or did you want to go on with something?
Go ahead.
So, okay, so there are these indicators potentially, right, of what someone's going to believe. But how much can we really generalize? There is this tendency, given how polarized we are in the US, to be like, oh, all of those Democrats or all of those Republicans. But is that, I mean, does that really exist? I know in general, generalizing, here I am generalizing as I'm saying this, but I'll just let you answer the question.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, any difference I talk about, right? Republicans value this, Democrats value this isn't a helpful word, but a probabilistic one, right? Like it's not definitive. It doesn't describe every single person, right? We are looking,
but does it describe most people or a lot of people?
I wouldn't even make that claim. It's an average difference, right? What we're doing is usually, and there are more and less sophisticated ways of doing this that are more and less complicated. But at the end of the day, when someone tells you, there's a significant effect or there's a difference between this group and that group, what they're looking at is sort of the average score, for example, on openness to new experiences among Democrats, the average score among Republicans, and comparing them.
Yeah.
Now, again, there are analyses that are much more complicated than this because you can bring in, dozens of other variables, right? Like you can control for income and education and all these things, right? But you're still looking at whether groups of people are different from each other on average, typically. And that leaves usually a lot of room for variability and diversity within those groups. There will be Republicans who are higher in openness to new experiences than some Democrats are. And that'll depend on the sample you've drawn and all that kind of thing. It varies from sample to sample, person to person, group to group.
Yeah, so there are some broad swaths or some tendencies, right, within these groups.
Exactly.
But it's not okay. So I want to. I'm actually going to open it up to Q&A. I do have some questions for you about political shortcuts that we take, but before we get into that, let us take some questions from the audience. So Anna, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great.
Can I, before we get started, I'm sorry,
Sure.
maybe the greenness is bothering me more than the other.
Oh, it actually just stopped. I don't know
Huzzah!
why, but it did.
Did it just stop right now?
Yeah, just now.
Okay. All right. This is helping me. All right. Go on. Sorry. I didn't mean to stop you.
No problem. All right. So I'm going to just jump up to our first audience question, and that is Jacob. So Jacob, I'm going to ask you to unmute your mic, and you can go ahead and ask your question live.
Hey there. Sorry, middle of a walk, but I hope you can see and hear me all right.
No worries. That's great. Yeah, I can hear you great. Thank you for taking us outside with you.
So it's a habit formed during COVID. Always good for a podcast or a talk on the walk.
Absolutely.
The question I asked in the chat was when you were talking about the early study of how people shift over time. That tendency not to really acknowledge the contradiction, from where you were at point A in time to point B in time. Has that rate increased in the modern political sphere? For instance, like, are we seeing a higher rate of, kind of pinballing effect, or is it kind of consistent? Is somebody who voted one way or who reported, feelings, on topic A in 2008 more likely to have changed by now, rather than 50 years ago when was it more of a long-term thing? And I guess that's kind of what I was going for.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, it's a great question, and I should be honest in saying that I don't know the answer, but now I will guess. That the question, as I hear it, is basically, have people's political issue positions become less stable over time, or more stable over time now than they used to be in the 60s?
Correct.
Perfect. If I had to guess, I would guess that they have become more stable over time, and I bet this data exists. But I do know that now there are more Democrats with consistently liberal positions on a wide variety of issues, and more Republicans with consistently conservative stances on a wide variety of issues than at any prior time in US history. Republicans and Democrats are both each more ideologically, internally consistent than they ever have been. Now that, again, that sort of network of interconnected positions, I think would keep itself more consistent over time, probably, because people are sort of perceiving more of a relation amongst those things than they used to. And the parties, too, are offering a more sort of consistent and polarized menu of options than they did in the past. And that, too, may keep people relatively consistent over time.
All right, Lauren, we have our next question. You can go ahead and ask it.
Hi. So kind of going off of this, you mentioned people's issue positions tend to shift a lot more over time than their actual political identity or party affiliation or their ideology. So my question was, is there any research which shows how rare or how common it is for people to completely shift their affiliation or ideology at some point in their life?
Yes, the people are very interested in explaining when and why people switch parties. And it's rare enough that I'm embarrassed to admit that I'm hard pressed to think of, when people would actually switch from one party to another. There is one.
So you're saying people
source, at
don't.
least.
You're saying people mostly don't switch parties.
Yes, that's right.
Almost never do they switch parties.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
It's rare, right? Like it's hard to kind of track that. But people do over time. There are lots of repeated surveys of people over time that kind of figure that out. So one source of change over time would be sometimes when the parties choose, basically, if there's an issue that's very important to you, right? Which feels like an obvious answer, but I mean that's how it works, right? So parties sometimes intentionally choose wedge issues to try to drive the other party's coalition apart. I believe abortion was one example of such an issue in the 80s when the Republican Party strategically chose to integrate that into their platform. And the idea is that there were a lot of Democrats who were, who felt strongly about this issue, and who would have preferred sort of a pro-life to a pro-choice stance, right? And there is evidence. Now, there are other issues. Unfortunately, it's been a long time since I read this book, but political officials and party officials and organizers can use, and sorry, I'm again taking agency away from people, right? Let me put it in a more generous way, right? You can change what you're selling as a party to try to recruit more people to your side. And if it's an issue that people care more about, that can work because people will follow issues that are deeply morally important to them in that way. And that's the best example of party switching that I can think of off the top of my head.
So that's another example for that. It's less rooted in values or some kind of consistent ideology, and it's more about attracting people to your party or differentiating one party from another?
And maybe I'm being cynical, right? But I mean, we're talking specifically in this instance about times the parties have changed what they're selling, right? Because if the party has if the party, and we're talking about the national party at this level, right? Like the organized, intentional entity of like the Republican or Democratic parties, they have usually a platform, and if they change that platform, I don't know how often parties change their platforms because of a collective evolution of principles at the elite level, right? I think the party leaders would change the platform if they think, what we're doing now isn't working. And we need to, because that's not really the job of the party, is not to dictate, ideally, values to the mass public, right?
Has that happened often, that parties have completely changed course on specific issues?
Well, so there have been, and here we're getting a little bit outside my territory because I know more about sort of public thought than the parties as organizations. But there were major realignments in the so in the 60s, when the Democrats sort of took ownership of the civil rights movement and legislation, and conversely, when Nixon pursued the Southern strategy to kind of take the other side of that issue. The sort of silent majority, moral majority message that Reagan and that campaign put forward, I think, was a shift in the direction that I mentioned. And there are many, many others that are just sort of outside of my realm of expertise because I know more about individual citizen behavior than institutions and organizations.
Sure. No, thanks for that, though. All right, Anna, back over to you.
All right. We have Jillian up next. Jillian, go ahead.
Hey, Pierce. We were wondering if you could tell us a little more about how you determine or how people determine that values are formed after political identity, and how you could actually differentiate that that's a real like life cycle effect versus something that's been changing over generations. And also, has that been changing across generations?
Interesting. Okay, yeah. So there are a few studies that I'm trying to think of the most effective place to start this story. So there are a few studies that have been done looking at this sort of pattern of influence from values to political identity and vice versa. And I will say that these studies focus primarily on liberal versus conservative sort of commitments. And they focus specifically on those 5 values, the moral foundations that I mentioned before, and sort of harm, care, equality, fairness, authority, in-group loyalty, and purity, divinity, sanctity. Now, when you split values into those 5 categories, and when you measure them with the specific questionnaires that have been used to measure those values over time, the team that did this, and some of them are at UNL. I wasn't working with them. I wasn't here at the time, but one of my colleagues was working on these projects. So please don't think I'm secretly biased. I know that these are people I know. Anyway, the first thing they did was they did a twin study. Basically, they looked at Australian twin data, and they looked at how heritable these moral foundations, these 5 different values, were. Because if these values are in fact sort of preceding ideology and partisanship, and ideology and partisanship are themselves heritable, the authors of this paper thought they could find them passed down genetically from parents to children. So you do twin studies for this because you can compare identical twins to fraternal twins, and identical twins are more similar to each other genetically. In fact, they're identical. And that gives you sort of an estimate of the sort of genetic effect. And they found, to their surprise, that the moral values had a very, very small heritable component. Like it didn't seem that these things were heritable, even though ideology and partisanship were. And so they ran some later studies, and the way they do this is basically they just administer multiple surveys that ask people the same questions at different points in time. right? So you ask people in 1 year, okay, hey, what are your stance on these political issues? What's your ideology, whatever. You ask them, here are various questions that can assess your moral values. Tell us what you think about harm, care, equality, and so on. Okay, we'll see you in a year. You ask them again. You ask them again, and you look at how those things change over time. And if values predict changes in partisanship later, you have a stronger basis for inferring that values are affecting, at least potentially, these political attachments. If you find that political attachments precede changes in values, you infer the opposite. And what they found was that the path from ideology to values was stronger than the path from values to ideology. Now, as for whether this has changed sort of in the aggregate over time, that I don't know, because these are 3 studies all from sort of the the 21st century that we're in now. So it's hard to say how these might have changed historically.
All right. Thanks for your question, Jillian. All right, so if we don't get to your question now, there's always the time after the breakout session for Q&A. So if we don't get to it now, we can definitely get to it later. So next up is Kieran. Kieran, if you can unmute yourself.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Cool. So my question is about how like a different voting system could affect like people's identity and polarization. Personally, I'm a fan of proportional representation, even though it's never going to happen. And I was wondering if that would lead people to pay more attention to the issues of the day rather than just following their party's position or something like that.
Great question. Anyway, great. And here again, I'm going to struggle to find where to start with it. So the first thing I should talk about is changes to the electoral college potentially, right? Is that the kind of thing you mean by proportional representation? Because I know, and that could be a broader thing too.
Sure.
So there are 3 reforms that I can think of to the electoral college that have kind of been proposed. And I'm resisting the urge to like get out the textbook and double check.
Yeah,
But
you don't have to. It's all right.
I know. I'm used to being called upon to like give students the correct information, so they take this exam and don't get mad at me. But so you can change the way that votes are allocated from states to the presidential candidate. You could do so by allocating a state's electoral votes based on the proportion of the vote they win. You could add a minor wrinkle to that, which is to change, to allocate the part of the electoral votes in proportion to the population, but then also give a bonus to the statewide winner. And that reflects sort of the House-Senate split that we have today. Or you could abolish the electoral college and have direct proportional elections, which would require a constitutional amendment. So the interesting thing about the other 2, and I mentioned this because it surprised me, switching to either of the 2 systems that did not abolish the electoral college actually would not have changed, I don't think, any of the elections in which the popular vote winner did not win. And in fact, under some of those systems, counterintuitively, sometimes there are a couple popular vote losers who would have actually won under those other systems. Which is too bad, right? Because I moved to Nebraska recently, and we have this fun system where like you can actually split the electoral vote of the state, which gives political minorities within a state, I think, a little bit more, or at least the feeling of more voice in the political process. But its effects on the presidential outcome, at least, are up for debate. Now, that said, you asked another, I think, really important question, which was, if we change the electoral system, would that lead people to think about politics differently, to engage with politics differently?
Mm-hmm.
And that, I don't know, because to see that, you would need to actually look at differences in how different municipalities or whatever do their elections.
Right.
And I don't know if political engagement is higher in Nebraska, for example, than in or in Maine, than in states that don't do these systems.
Yeah. On a country level, I was thinking of like countries like New Zealand or places that have like full proportional representation.
Yes.
Yeah.
One big effect of that is the lack of proportional representation in the United States is a big reason that we have such a two-party system, right?
Right.
A multi-party system is very hard. Like you don't get that in a system where you need to win an entire state's delegation to have a viable
Right. So
to have any votes for the presidency.
it's better to like consolidate and have a big block. Right.
It changes the incentives.
Thank you.
So I want to build upon Kieran's question because there's this underlying assumption. I don't know if this is what Kieran was implying, but in general, right, that we all need to be active citizens and be well-informed citizens. And that's the ideal. And I don't know about the people who are on the Zoom call, but for me, there's always this guilt of, oh, well, I don't know as much as I should. I'm not as involved as much as I should be. And I know that and so there's a lot of shitting all over myself around this. And that just seems impossible for us to be well-informed on every issue. And so, we do outsource some of our, so I guess what I'm wondering is that a reasonable ideal to be a well-informed voter? Other kinds of, and if that's not the ideal, or that's not ever, are there other ideals that are, or other aspirations that are more reasonable to ask of voters?
I do think that it is easy to be hard on people for not being attentive enough to politics. I think that, and political scientists will tell you this, right? The one puzzle for us as a field is figuring out why people vote at all, given their probability of influencing the election with their vote is so vanishingly low in almost any system. There are about 300 million Americans. And I guess really, if we want to influence the presidential election, we're only competing against the ones in our state. But when you think of the amount of time that it takes for you to figure out what all the candidates represent, the amount of time and effort it takes to figure out where you stand on all the relevant political issues and to weight those preferences and to select a candidate that you believe will best represent your preferences, and then register to vote, find a ballot and submit it on time without bubbling anything in wrong. It's a miracle that anybody votes at all. And so it's I don't want to say that it's an unreasonable ideal necessarily, but it is one that it's difficult to blame people for not living up to, because there are many other important things in our lives that we want to devote our time and energy to that we can derive more immediate and probably pervasive satisfaction from, like our relationships with other people, like the jobs that we actually need to do to survive and pay rent and eat. That's important. And so if you're wondering whether there's a more realistic ideal, I think there are ways to be sufficiently politically informed to make the decisions that are most important to us when we're called upon to do so. And it's a difficult balance to strike, right? But the question is basically asking ourselves, how do we want to influence the world? And if and what are the things that are absolutely the most important for us to pay attention to and to try to influence, and then paying specific attention to those things in how we participate in politics. So for example, whatever the two issues that are like most fundamentally important to you, spend your time figuring out where the parties stand on those. Spend your time figuring out where you stand on those, and try to get yourself represented on those fundamental things, because yeah, that's at least a good starting point.
I mean, that's a much more reasonable ask of citizens, at least in our current society. All right, Anna, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, so we're going to do one more question and then we'll go into the breakout rooms. One of our questions from one of our audience members sent in was about social media. And I'm going to pair this along with a little bit of a question about polarization. So the question is there any way to reverse some of the extreme polarization on both sides of the political spectrum? And also, if you could comment how social media has influenced our political, ideologies.
So that's a tough one. How to reduce political polarization and conflict is something I definitely want to try to figure out, and two, in many ways, and this is sort of an open question. A couple things that come to mind are a lot of people in political disagreements think that they have an urge to share political facts, right? To defend your position, to explain why you believe something about an issue. These are the facts that led me to this position. And they think that by providing other people with those facts, that will help them to understand their position and maybe also understand why their position is the correct and better one and they should change their mind. Now, it turns out that political facts are less persuasive than personal experiences and talking about, my uncle lost his health insurance because of X, Y, and Z, right? That kind of thing lays the groundwork for a more productive discussion, I think, if I'm remembering the paper right. Certainly it makes people, I think, more tolerant of other people, broadly speaking, in these kinds of political disagreements. So that might help. Now that's a very individual solution, right? Like, how are you going to get along with somebody who disagrees with you about politics? How to reduce polarization on the national scale is something that I'm not sure how to tackle. It would require sort of mutual disarmament by both members of both ideological camps, both political parties, that I think is realistically unlikely. Social media, I can just say real quick, I think top of the head, that maybe the biggest impact of social media on our politics has been in making it more segmented, right? It provides people it makes it easier to select the news that appeals to your worldview and the political information that supports what you believe to be true. And in that way, people become, I think, a little bit more isolated from competing opinions, facts, and realities. And that, I think, obviously can contribute to polarization.
Right.
So a quick question before we go to the breakouts, Anna. I mean, that takes a stance up, or the assumption that political polarization is a bad thing. So that's one question I have. And then the other thing is, which I know we do not have time to go into now, which is, well, why is political polarization happening? Yes, Americans say that they don't want a polarized, they don't want Americans to be so polarized, but we are, and there are probably people who want it to be that way. So there are the systems and the structures that keep it in place. But rather than going into all that stuff, I guess the question is polarization is it a bad thing?
So I'm going to do a very social science thing and give you a few definitions of polarization. So there's polarization in the sense of disliking people from the other party, right? And that's potentially bad to the extent that it makes us dislike people that we would otherwise get along with, or dislike people who we would like to have good relationships with. It's potentially bad to the extent that it closes us off to ideas from people who we don't like, that when they might be good ideas. It's potentially okay if it leads us to dislike people who we think are worth disliking and competing against and attempting to frustrate at every turn. But and that's, that's something that I can't dictate to you, right? Like everybody has their moral values, right? And if someone is trying to create a world that is anathema to you, it is not necessarily incumbent upon you to like them. Although we do have laws about, certain ways that you're obliged to treat other living people in the country. You can also think of polarization as the distance between people on their political opinions, right? How far to the extremes, to the poles, have they moved? And that many political scientists would contend, I think, is definitely not a bad thing, because having extreme positions can motivate you to participate in politics, which we want sometimes. It can make it more obvious who in a two-party system you're supposed to vote for, right? So the two-party system is a better reflection of your preferences if you can put yourself in a position that like very clearly on one side or the other. So that's more of a mixed bag. Although, being very far apart makes it harder to elect single representatives who effectively represent people on opposite ideological poles.
Well, then also can agree with each other and find compromise on things.
Yes, to the extent that you want laws passed.
Yeah. Sometimes it's a good thing. Anna, I'll hand it back over to you.
Sounds good. All right, so we'll take some time to go into the breakout rooms. We'll have about 3 to 4 people per room. And I will send out some conversation starters once everyone gets in their rooms, but feel free to also come up with your own questions that you're still thinking about. So give me 1 minute and I will put everyone in the breakout rooms. Okay, 3 to 4 people. All right, here we go. How'd they go? Breakout rooms?
Great.
All right. Yeah, I hope you had some good time for discussion. Laura, is there anything else we need to do before we go back to Q&A?
No, let's do it. Well, actually, one thing I'll say is that we do record all of our events and we put them on a podcast as well as on our YouTube channel. So this we'll be emailing out, as well as we have a survey that in case you need to head out before 8:30, we'll put in the chat that we read every single survey entry and we'd love to hear your thoughts about this event. So let us know what you think. But otherwise, let's get back to the Q&A.
All right. So the link in the survey is in the chat, but let's get back to the Q&A here. So I'm going to jump back to some of our Eventbrite questions.
Anna, can I jump in while you're looking at those real
Yeah,
quick?
go ahead.
So Lauren asked me about some things. When do people change parties, if at all?
Mhm.
And I neglected some important and arguably very obvious sources of political side switching. One is that parents and peers both influence people. The influence of peers becomes larger as people age. In late adolescence, people can often switch political sides by virtue of the influence of their peers. That I think intuitively is resonates with a lot of people, and that's a real thing. I can tell you that peers are, for example, much more influential than professors. That kind of basis for political ideology or partisan change sort of from other people also, I think, continues later in life. On average, right? If you come to be surrounded with a lot of conservative or a lot of liberal people, you may adjust your voting behavior in that direction.
So I have a follow-up question about that. Is it true that you get more conservative as you get older?
My impression is that the evidence does not necessarily support that assertion. I remember in a vague kind of hearsay way that it may be more about having kids than about growing older. But I have also seen, I believe the data better supports the argument that there are generational differences in political ideology and partisanship, rather than the word I think is ontogenetic, over the course of an individual's life. I just wanted to impress you all that I could reverse a word I learned in college.
That was impressive.
Well,
I
it
was
might be
impressed.
wrong, so don't be too impressed.
I'll look it up. All right. So one of the topics that someone was interested in was hearing about political messaging and how that's changed over time in the last 100 years. 100 years is a long time. So if you want to narrow it down to maybe the last 20 years, that's
Yeah,
also
I don't
fine.
have the faintest idea. So when I think of political messaging, I think of a couple things. One are those few changes in partisanship and party alignment that I mentioned. Now we could go further back to look at how sort of the Whigs and the Democratic Republicans and how parties have evolved over the course of U.S. history, and that is something that I could kind of recite to you from the textbook for my American government class, but that I don't know and research a lot about myself. But the parties have realigned from time to time. In more recent history, I think probably the big important change in political communication that has occurred is a shift toward more segmented media, right? In the sort of 50s and 60s, you had the era of big broadcast television, right? That's the way it is. And Americans were relying on a relatively unified stream of media and news. Now, journalists may be kind of nostalgic for that time, and many of us may be, but it was a pretty unique period in American history, and one that seems to be sort of splitting apart as the internet and cable and all these things have kind of fragmented our sources of news, and again, sort of allowing people more choice in where they get their news than they had at the time, which allows for sort of, you know, when people have choice, they select things that they like, and the things they like tend to support their beliefs.
So we have about 12 more minutes left. If you have more questions, go ahead, put in the chat, make the most of the time we have with Professor Pierce here. So another question someone had was, is the political landscape going to look much different 20 years from now? We did a little bit of, in the past, but
I know even less about that. I'm trying to figure out what things are going to look like next year. But the I think the most I can't even hazard a guess as to 20 years from now. I will be very curious to see what happens with the current lines of division in the Republican Party. The controversies about Liz Cheney type figures and Marjorie Taylor Greene and or is it Greene anyway? People have lots of takes on this, and I don't want to have one because I don't want to embarrass myself later on. I think that we are in an unusual political moment. I mean, that could be true. I could say that at literally any time, and it would probably be arguably true. But that's a development that I'm curious to see. Who will the candidate they put forward in 2020 be?
Thanks for giving it your best shot. That's a very open-ended question, I know.
Thank you. Well, I gave you a very open-ended answer.
All right. So another question is, are there incentives for people with different views to listen to a person with a different opinion? And are there ways to maybe develop any sort of incentive, or how can either we listen to those with other views, or how can we help people listen to others who have different opinions?
So the incentives, I think, are different depending on whether we're talking about your average citizen in the mass public versus political officials or people in positions of power in government or whatever, right? People in government, on the one hand, have the incentive to listen to diverse perspectives to the extent that that might help them identify the most effective policy. On the other hand, they have a disincentive to the extent that people on opposing sides of a political issue want something in the end, like an effective policy. We can kind of agree on that if it's like, oh, we want to boost the economy. That agreement doesn't exist when we're talking about things like, same-sex marriage, abortion, these things where the outcome is the controversy, right? Now, in the mass public, the incentives to talking to people we disagree about are the incentives to talk to anybody at all, right? Do you value having a relationship with this person? And if there's nobody in your world who you value having a relationship with, if they're from the opposing political side, then those incentives are probably absent for you. Except to the extent that you want to sort of articulate except to the extent that you want information from that side to inform your views or what have you, right? But a lot of us depend on people who disagree with us for, maybe we're coworkers, maybe we're related to them, right? Maybe we're friends or friends of friends or something like that, right? And those, honestly, I think are also probably the most powerful and realistic incentives to cross the ideological divide and hear some of that cross-cutting information. Because if you don't, I don't think, for example, that creating incentives for people to interact with opposite ideology or opposite party people on Twitter is going to necessarily successfully incent them to engage in a thoughtful, constructive way, right? Like, I mean, giving people a little intervention where they're like, hey, we'll enter you into a raffle if you talk to 10 conservatives. Yeah, and I know that's probably not what the question meant, right? I think that building human relationships that are valuable to us is the thing that would make it worth trying to affiliate with politically diverse others.
Gotcha. All right. Since Jacob's just sent his last question in, I'm going to give that last question to you.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead and you want to read it for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. Let me see if I can pull it up. Basically, what I was, let me pull up the chat. Because if you think of the rise of social media and cable news as a disruptive moment in the long history of the world, do you think there will eventually be a settling that occurs? I think it seems to be like a sort of fever pitch that's still occurring. As someone who's, kind of come of age in the social media age. I still remember a time before I had a cell phone. But I'm thinking of how, like rises in communication, technology, like the printing press, radio, telegraph has often like disrupted the system and caused anxieties, on a grand scale. But eventually there is a new equilibrium, a new norm that settles in. Do you think there's anything on the sort of the grand psychological stage, kind of communal psyche that will eventually settle in, or do you think we're destined to constantly be at each other's throats in terms of social media and the like?
Well, certainly people have a very robust ability to get used to almost anything, right? But I'm not sure I would say that, and I don't know really a lot about media history, but I'm not sure necessarily that I would say that we settled into equilibrium, right? That there's a big disruption when we get like the telegraph, the radio and TV, then we settle into an equilibrium, and then something new comes along. I think that maybe what happens instead is something new comes along, and then we think, oh, it used to be so different, right? And we think of the way that things were for 10 years prior to that as a long-standing equilibrium. And I think that it's easy for us to look back at the era of TV as one of long-standing equilibrium, but we already have pointed to a couple of changes in how sort of the broadcast era moving to cable might have led to some changes. Likewise in social media, right? Right now, it may seem, the technology is rapidly evolving and it depends on a lot of these private companies. But the way that information is communicated through social media, I think, it will continue to change, and I think that change may just be the new norm. Although, we could say that in hindsight, it may be clearer what the key themes, what the equilibrium was during our period, right? Is the way that adolescents are using TikTok now fundamentally different than the way that Facebook was used in Arab Spring, right? Like these are a long distance apart, but maybe there are connections that a more knowledgeable person than I could draw with the benefit of hindsight.
So we're reaching halfway past the hour. So Professor Ekstrom, I have a final question for you, which is, if there is one, maybe two takeaways that you would like our audience to get from this topic, from the field of political psychology, or how political opinions are formed or how they change over time, what would you say that takeaway? What would you want to leave people with?
Oh man, that's a good question. I think that first, and I haven't talked as much about this as I probably should have to make it the main takeaway, but I think that it is, I've talked a lot about how partisanship kind of pushes people in a lot of different directions, right? That our political commitments shape how we see the world in ways that we might not want to admit. And I think that it is easy to talk about basically political bias in other people and to acknowledge that, because we see evidence of it very clearly and obviously and constantly, right? We look around like, oh, look at those idiots. Don't they see the hypocrisy in their positions? And I guess a message that I would want to impart is that it is worth remembering that the universality of that bias, includes us. That we are, when we say everyone is biased, we are one. So to kind of bear that in mind, and to try to just to appreciate the impact that that has on our decision making, on the issue stances that we're willing to take, on the things we're willing to read and believe and share with other people, I think is a useful thing to appreciate.
Oh, go ahead. Did you have something else you wanted to share?
I think if you think that's a good note to end on,
I
think we
do
should
think it's a
just cut
good note to end on, right? We're not exceptions to these rules, right?
Right.
That's the big takeaway that I'm getting, and for us to perhaps also try to look for what biases we hold, and see how we can learn through that introspection. So Professor Ekstrom, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
This was a great conversation, and I hope people got a lot of value out of it. I know I have a number of things that I'm still going to think about. So we'll be sending a follow-up survey, as well as a recording of the event for you to share with folks in your life and some key takeaways. And we hope that you attend future Civic Series events that are coming down the pipeline this summer and this fall. Have a good evening, everybody.
See you all. Thanks for coming.
See ya. Is there anything else should I hang around so we can close things out? Hey, Paul.